Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to focus on the art of Southeast Asia. We're going to spend most of our time looking at the art of India. So we're going to be focusing here on the Indian subcontinent, and we are initially going to be interested in the art of the Indus River Valley, or sometimes what is known as the Harappan civilization. This is a civilization that developed around the 3rd millennium, so this is going to be concurrent with some of the other civilizations we've been studying, ancient Sumer, early other Mesopotamian cultures, and early pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom Egypt. So that's in the general time frame. We are looking at a culture that develops around the river valley, so this is nothing new at this point. You all should be familiar with this concept. Where there's water, there is civilization. In this case, the Indus River. This is a large civilization at its peak, hitting something around 5 million people. What makes this culture different from the other cultures that would have been concurrent with it are that this is a culture that we have no major evidence of war or warfare. Very few weapons have been found. We do have evidence of artifacts that point to trade with Sumer and other Mesopotamian civilizations. What's also fascinating about this culture is there are no major temples that have, or palaces that have been identified. So in terms of the societal structure, we're not really sure how it operated. There's two cities that where most of our artifacts come from, a city of Mohenjo-Daro, or Mohenjo-Daro I should say, and Harappa, hence giving the name Harappan civilization. There's also very little art objects that have been found, so compared to Sumer and other Mesopotamian cultures, we're not looking at a lot of small-scale artifacts. We will look at some structures, though. We do know that this was a singular, unified culture with standardized measurements, language, and religion. We just don't know how to translate that language. So, once again, there's a big question mark over kind of everything here. Now, what we do know is, let me move my little guy down here. This is the Great Bath, and this is one of the major structures from Mohenjo-Daro in what is today Pakistan. This is a communal bath. It is probably designed for some sort of ritual bathing, maybe a religious ceremony. We're not really absolutely certain here, but we do know that the craftsmanship is absolutely incredible. The pool itself and the surrounding structures are measured exactly up to a millimeter. The brickwork is also exacting, and what this tells us is this was a culture with really advanced engineering skills. They also had a public water and sewage system. So this is, we're looking at pretty high level civic engineering here. As I said, there's evidence that this culture traded with Mesopotamia, and there's also evidence of contact with the Arabian Peninsula and China. But beyond that, we don't know much more about this culture, except they often built these large public baths. They were fantastic engineers, and they traded with, pardon me guys, it's been a long day, and they've traded with nearby cultures. Let's look at some of the artifacts that we have. The image on the left is a robed male figure, possibly a kind of a priest figure or some sort of ruler. Once again, we don't fully know, but the band across his head signifies probably some sort of level of importance. He's also wearing a robe with a decoration we call a trefoil, which just means 3 lobes, right? But this sort of trefoil, we don't know what that means. We don't know if it has some sort of significance, but it's certainly you know, I find this culture fascinating and intriguing because there is still so much about it we don't know. On the right is a nude male torso. Notice the sort of fleshy way the body is portrayed here with a sort of belly and kind of the soft flesh, which is actually really quite exquisite. There is, I think, a level of craftsmanship here. There's a level of naturalism and realism that we don't often see in artwork this early. But what these mean, we don't really know. There's no real evidence to point the way. You know, we can compare to other civilizations and you know, draw the conclusion that if it was important enough to have an image made of it, it of course must have been important. And whether it has spiritual or political significance, though, that is still kind of up in the air. We do also have some evidence of seals, and you know, we've already seen cylinder seals, if you remember, from ancient Sumer, but these were used in trade and to signify ownership and who was trading the goods. You can see some of the other seals that we have found up here. These are actually, this is the seal itself, and these are clay imprints made with the seal. But if you look at this image here, we're seeing something rather interesting. We're seeing a bull-headed figure, so this probably denotes some sort of power, and sitting in a what is known as the lotus position, or sort of the yogi position, with the legs folded. So you know, we're going to see this position in the two great religions to emerge out of India, Buddhism and Hinduism. And at this early age, we're looking at this Indus Valley culture, which may or may not be ethnically the same as the subsequent Indian cultures, but we're certainly seeing an influence on these later cultures with the use of this sort of lotus position. And then we have, in around 1700 BCE, a influx of people from Central Asia, from a group of people we call Aryans, coming possibly from Iran or other places in Central Asia, modern-day Iran. They settle in the Indus River Valley area and spread out. They spoke a language called Sanskrit, and they brought with them 4 holy books called Vedas, which mean knowledge. And we refer to this period as the Vedic period. And what we're looking at now are really sort of the roots of Indian religion, of Hinduism especially, being laid down, because these Vedas are still part of the Hindu belief, or at least form sort of the root of Hindu belief. They've been expanded on and sort of mutated and grown since these early periods. But these first 4 Vedas were written by the priest, known as Brahmins, and these were top of a social hierarchy, or what is known as a caste system. And of course, the caste system in India has still survived to one degree or another to modern day. But the Brahmins, the priests, were at the top of the social hierarchy, and below that you had warriors and traders and laborers. Pardon me again, guys. But the Brahmins practiced these very complicated and long, sometimes hours and hours and hours long rituals where they would make sacrifices to the gods. And this sort of ritualistic practice becomes, you know, sort of central to these early Vedic practices. And then we have another influx of religious texts, and these are known as the Upanishads. And these start to come around the Ganges River Valley around the year 800 BCE or so. And these are religious texts that also introduce some really important concepts that will be central to both Hinduism and Buddhism. And it can get very complicated, but we're going to keep it down to two right now. The concept of samsara, or this cycle of birth and rebirth. So this concept of life and death and then reincarnation. Then a concept of karma, which is the idea that your past actions determine your future rebirth. And the idea is that the ultimate goal is to reach a state of liberation from this cycle, what is known as moksha. And this is to break the cycle of reincarnation, where you basically go back and you rejoin sort of the universal oneness of things, and you have sort of cast aside this sort of physical existence forever. But it takes sort of the practice. It takes this sort of reoccurrence of life after life after life of life, and your behavior in those life cycles determine where you end up the next time. So we'll come back to Hinduism, but I want to talk about Buddhism first. So Buddhism is a religion that begins around the 6th century BCE, and it's based around the teachings of a guy named Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha is a prince in Nepal. He's the eldest son of a clan called the Shakya clan. But the legend goes there's a prophecy that he would either grow up to be a great conqueror or a religious leader. And the idea is that Siddhartha grows up spoiled and sheltered. He lives the life of luxury. He's this pampered prince who basically has this life of ease and no cares and sort of decadence. And at the age of 29, he leaves the palace for the first time. And he sees real life. He sees sickness, he sees poverty, and he sees old age, and he's disturbed by it. And even more than that, he's sort of curious why there is suffering. As a man who has more or less been sheltered from suffering his whole life, and now that he's kind of been hit in the face with it, he doesn't understand it. He wants to get to the sort of root nature of it. He wants to know why. And he goes out to seek the truth. And so he leaves his family behind. He even leaves his wife and his son. He leaves his princely duties behind to go seek spiritual enlightenment. There is a tradition in India established at this point called asceticism. And ascetics are people who practice self-denial. They often live really harsh lives. They will live away from civilization in the woods or in the desert. They will deprive themselves of food or sleep. They will perform, acts of lengthy meditation, also acts of sort of like self-punishment. But the idea is that by sort of eschewing the world around them, they will sort of find this kind of spiritual enlightenment. And so he does this. And he does it for quite some time. He does it over 5 or 6 years. And he realizes that he's no closer to finding the answer about why people are suffering. And so he goes to this place, Gaya, and he goes to basically a nature park, a forest preserve where there's deer, this deer park, and he sits under this tree, this Bodhi tree, and he's sitting there, and he already has some followers with him, and he starts to contemplate, and all of a sudden he reaches this stage of enlightenment. The answer comes to him after 7 days, and he becomes the Buddha. Buddha is a title, right? It is not, Siddhartha Gautama is a Buddha. He's the main Buddha. He is sort of the progenitor of Buddhism, but he is not the only Buddha. It's just an enlightened one. But so after 49 days, he travels through this place, Sarnath, and he meets some followers, and they see this change in him. So from this event, three main branches of Buddhism, and there's really even more than that, sort of spring up. The Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana are three traditions, and there are some similarities. We're not going to get into those today, but I do want you to know that, like all major religions that we studied, there's more than one. There's more than one way of practicing that religion. In Christianity, for instance, we've looked at, Catholicism and Greek Orthodox, and there was a bunch of others we didn't even talk about, and we haven't even seen Protestantism invented yet. So, there's so many different ways of practicing Christianity. And Islam, there's two large traditions. There's Shia and Sunni traditions. In Buddhism, there's a bunch. In Hinduism is made up of dozens and dozens and dozens of local traditions, maybe hundreds of local traditions. So as long as you have enough people, you have people to interpret things the way they want to interpret them, and incorporate their own traditions and beliefs, you're going to have religions with lots of different sort of flavors. So take everything that I'm saying here about Buddhism with a big grain of salt, because what I'm describing here is sort of the general sort of history of Buddhism, and we're going to look at some of the early art of Buddhism, but I am by no means an expert on it, and I am by no means talking about any one specific tradition. We're looking at the art in a very general way, and that's what these surveys do. I introduce you to the topics so you can get just the smallest sort of grasp on what's going on. So anyway, Buddha comes up with this. He sees this enlightenment, right? He experiences enlightenment, I should say, and he finds the path to what he calls in Buddhism is called nirvana, the cessation of this endless cycle of samsara. And Buddha says basically there's a middle path. There are these two extremes that are not to be indulged in. The one that is devoted to sensual pleasure with reference to sensual objects, base, vulgar, common, ignoble, unprofitable, and that which is devoted to self-affliction, painful, ignoble, and unprofitable. In other words, he said, this pendulum shouldn't swing one two way or the other. One way or the other. I can't talk today, guys. But you should find this sort of middle path, because any sort of extreme denial and asceticism and will lead you nowhere, and indulging every sort of pleasure will lead you nowhere. So this will lead to calm, a direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding yourself from this reality and this endless sort of cycle. So what was revealed to Buddha then, what were the Four Noble Truths. And these are the pathway out to this sort of endless cycle. And so the Four Noble Truths are realizing, first of all, that life is suffering, right? And then the second is the cause of that suffering, which is our own desires. Our desires for wealth, our desire for pleasure, our desire for power. These desires cause this suffering. But the good news is found in number 3, that we can overcome these desires. And how do you overcome them? Well, the way is shown in the 4th Noble Truth. We can overcome these desires by following what is known as the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path consists of 8 sort of ways of navigating the world, the 8 ways of seeing the world, which is through right understanding, using right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And if we sort of right ourselves, literally, then we can break this endless cycle of sort of samsara, of birth and death and rebirth, and we can sort of reach this state of nirvana, this state of the cessation of this cycle, and reach sort of this sort of kind of perfect understanding. We've removed ourselves then from the endless fruitless cycle. So, pretty powerful stuff, right? So, the thing is, Buddhism remained a rather small religion up until around the 4th century BCE. So it existed for several centuries until the Mauryan dynasty. And after the death of Alexander the Great, one of his former generals, remember Alexander the Great made it almost all the way to the Indus River. And Alexander the Great turned back his men, and he died basically on the journey home. And his empire was divided among three generals. And one of those generals, a guy named Seleucus Nicator, invaded India, and he was defeated by Chandragupta Maurya. And so this is the birth of the Mauryan dynasty, whose capital was at Pataliputra, which is sort of described as one of the great cities at the time, an ambassador to the Seleucus. Talked about how it had this huge wooden fence, and it had something like 570 towers and 64 gates. So this is a very powerful, wealthy dynasty. But the important guy out of this dynasty that I want you to know is a guy named Ashoka, who ruled in the early 3rd century. And Ashoka was this great military leader, and he had just conquered this region called Kalinga. But in doing so, something like, and I've read numbers from 100,000 to 150,000 people, civilians and soldiers, were killed. And when he heard about these numbers, or when he saw these numbers, because he fought too, he was horrified at the death and destruction that he had wrought. And he embraced pacifism, and he embraced Buddhism, he embraced this middle way. And he banned hunting, he banned violent sports, he banned hard labor and servitude, because he wanted to create a life of balance and goodness. But what he did is, using his considerable wealth and power, he spread Buddhism through both legislation, but also through art. And throughout his kingdom, he erected numerous columns that were dedicated to Buddha. And so this is one of many. This is what's a lion pillar. But there were these pillars. They were typically carved out of one solid piece of stone, so both the capital and the column itself were carved out of stone, usually with a depiction of some sort of Buddhist symbol at the top, very often a lion. A lion, of course, is king of the beast, and sort of a representation of Buddha, Buddha's place within Buddhism itself. But these pillars also act as something we call an axis mundi, A-X-I-S-M-U-N-D-I, literally meaning a world axis. And these are columns that sort of link the celestial world, the spiritual world, and the earthly world, right? It goes from deep in the ground to high in the sky, and the idea is that it sort of represents a sort of point where earth and heaven meet. But these were placed all around the kingdom, and especially along pilgrimage routes, Buddhist pilgrimage routes. But Ashoka did a lot to sort of spread Buddhism and sort of turn it into one of the great world religions. So these pillars are just a part of it. Let's look at the top of another pillar. So here we have another lion capital. This comes from a place at Sarnath. And you'll notice, first of all, that stylistically this is very similar to Mesopotamian or Persian art. Look at the way the fur is made of these sort of overlapping, kind of almost like leaf-like sort of shapes, which is similar to some of the art of the Achaemenid dynasty, and also of various cultures in Mesopotamia. We have here 4 animals representing the 4 corners of the earth, so literally this emphasizing this idea of sort of earth and sky kind of coming together. Down here we see this wheel representing Dhamma, or the law, the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. And then we also have more animals representing the four corners of the earth. Then we see the lotus. A lotus is a flower that blooms and dies and blooms and dies, reflecting this idea of samsara, this idea of birth, rebirth, over and over and over again. This is the great stupa of Sanchi. A stupa is basically a mound. It's not a burial mound. It is, but it contains relics. It contains, in this case, ashes. Not all of the ashes, but some of the ashes of the Buddha. But the great stupa comes from sort of earlier Indian religious practices and traditions. And this is something we're going to see, is that Buddhism, like all religions, borrows heavily from other religions that have come before. And so Buddhism certainly does this. But this is at the end of a pilgrimage route to the Buddha. And so you can imagine pilgrims walking hundreds and hundreds of miles when they get to this stupa. And what are they confronted with? A gate and a fence. And this gate basically operates as sort of an opening between the spiritual world and the secular world, the earthly world. And this fence sort of separates those two worlds, but this is a place where those two worlds come together, and you pass under this gate filled with symbols relating to the Buddha. Now notice there's no images of Buddha himself, and we haven't seen images of Buddha himself, because in the earliest centuries of Buddhism, Buddha is a teacher. He has not yet sort of reached kind of a divine sort of Buddhism, as doesn't treat Buddha necessarily as a divine figure, or certainly as a godlike figure. And so the emphasis here is not on Buddha himself, but on his teachings. And so here is a shrine about Buddha containing the ashes of Buddha, and yet there are no images of Buddha, not yet. Anyway, not at this early stage in the artistic development of the religion. So here's a diagram of the great stupa. So we can see four gates, representing the four cardinal directions, representing the concept of earth. And then we see the stupa itself, which represents the divine realm, the sky, the dome of the heavens, right? And there's lots of other things here sort of relating to the concepts of Buddhist thought. For example, there's this idea here of the three jewels of Buddhism with this what's called the Kshatras at the top, which represent the Buddha, the law, the Dharma, or the Dhamma, however you want to spell it, and then the concept of the community of Buddhists, the Sangha. So there's a lot of kind of numerical symbolism here, as well as symbolism relating to the concept of earth and sky. And then when one enters through one of these gates, one of these Toranas, then the pilgrims would walk around or circumambulate around. Once again, sort of reflecting this concept of the idea of a cycle, right? Moving around. Well, let's look at one of these Toranas. This is the East Torana. And we see a lot of symbols here dedicated, sort of representing sort of Buddhist life, the Buddha's life and Buddhist thought. But, pardon me guys, if you look over here, we have something rather interesting. This is something called a Yakshi. And a Yakshi is a fertility figure that comes from pre-Buddhist religious practices. And as you can see, she is rather sexualized here. And that seems rather odd for a religion that focuses on moderation, that focuses on sort of rejecting desire. And we have an image here that in many ways represents sexual desire in a rather almost explicit sort of way. So what's going on? Well, so first of all, religions often adopt symbolism of the cultures that came before. And they turn those symbols into they change the meaning of those symbols. And if we haven't gotten to the chapter on early Christianity yet, you'll see that happen in early Christianity, where early Christians will adopt, especially within the Roman Empire, traditional Roman pagan symbols and use them as their own, and also take Roman architecture and convert it into Christian architecture. We'll see that happen a lot. But we're seeing something very similar. We're seeing this fertility goddess, this Yakshi, basically being turned into a symbol for spiritual growth. Because as she touches this tree as a fertility symbol, the tree blossoms and blooms and produces heavy fruit. And this fruit, though, becomes spiritual fruit. And so the concept here is that you're looking at spiritual growth. And these fertility symbols imply that following this path of Buddha will produce spiritual fruits. And so here is another Yakshi. Just as you can see, this is very common in early Buddhist imagery. But eventually the Mauryan dynasty falls. An emperor is assassinated. His general tries to take over. That's called the Sungha kingdom, but it also falls too. And it's replaced by another kingdom, the Satavahanas. And then ultimately an empire called the Kushan Empire rises under a king, Kanishka, and that becomes very rich, but rich through trade. But ultimately, this one large Mauryan dynasty sort of breaks up and dissipates into a bunch of smaller empires. I want to now look at some art from Pakistan, which has a wealth of early Buddhist art. This is a frieze depicting a relief sculpture of the Enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, at the park, the deer park, where Buddha reaches or finds enlightenment. So we see, first of all, the story kind of I want to look now at some art from Pakistan, and some art that is... I want to now look at some art from Pakistan from around the 2nd century CE. And these are some of the earliest images of Buddha. So we start to see images of Buddha around this time because of the religion changes. Buddha is now not just a sort of teacher, but he's also now divine. And so we start to see these figurative pictures of Buddha. And this comes from a frieze depicting the life of the Buddha. We first see his birth to his mother, Lumbini. We see him right here. And in the next image we see Siddhartha has grown up. He has now become Buddha, and we see the moment where he is at the Bodh Gaya, where he reaches this sort of point of enlightenment. We can see down here he is sort of tempted by sort of beautiful women and Mara, these kinds of demon creatures, which reflect this concept of temptation, which reflect this sort of concept of desire. We can see the Bodhi tree above him here, of course. And then we see over here his first sermon at Sarnath, and then here we see his death. You'll notice, though, there is a huge influence from Greek art in these sculptures, and this comes from Alexander the Great, and this comes from Alexander the Great's military campaign towards India that spread Greek or Hellenistic art along its way. These friezes in many ways have very similarities to, well, for example, like the Parthenon frieze with its sort of clusters of people. and also in the drapery and the robes of the Buddha itself. There is definitely an influence of Greek tradition in both of these. And this is something that we studied, or you will study depending on the order you're watching these videos, in the chapter on ancient Greece and Hellenism. Is Alexander the Great brought Greek art and its traditions to a large part of the ancient world. So let's look at some other images of Buddha. These also come from Gandhara. We see an image of a standing Buddha, and then we see a Buddha in sort of Adhyana Mudra, in holding his hands in this symbol of meditation, and the meditating Buddha. And I've given some examples of some Greek sculpture here, so you can see the similarities in the drapery and in the way the figures are depicted just in general. There is a real sense of realism in these sculptures that very much come from the Greek tradition. I love, especially in this standing Buddha, you can see his belly through his garment, you can see his knees poking through. There is a realism here that we often associated with Greek art, and it's certainly here in this tradition. So these, like I said, are some of the earliest images, these sort of second century images of, second and third century images of Buddha are some of the first figurative images of Buddha. And then we have a later tradition, a tradition called the Mathura. This comes from an empire in India called the Kushan Empire. And these are influenced heavily by traditional Indian religious imagery, especially yakshas. And yakshas are the male version of what we saw earlier, the yakshis. But they're these kind of central figures. And here we see Buddha sitting under a Bodhi tree. This is a yaksha over here. And you can see it's in sort of a kind of a central dance pose, similar to the yakshi we saw earlier. Notice there's a more kind of a rubberiness to the way Buddha's limbs are depicted. There's a sort of a fleshiness to the skin. The realism isn't quite the level of the Greek-inspired art. This is coming from a different tradition with sort of an emphasis more on kind of a fluidity of the form. But we see Buddha sitting on a lion throne. Once again, lion symbols of Buddha. And we'll talk about all of sort of the symbols of his hair and everything else here in just a moment. But you're seeing a more sort of traditional Indian depiction of Buddha. And then we have the Gupta Empire. This is a new empire that rises in the 4th century, and they kind of saw themselves as the successors to the Mauryan Empire, and especially the era of the rule of Ashoka that we saw earlier. And their heyday was under a ruler named Chandragupta II. They were eventually brought down by the Huns, but who wasn't? It was during this time that images of Buddha really kind of become canonical. And we start to see these two older traditions, this Mathuran tradition, this fleshy, rubbery tradition, and this Gandharan tradition, this more Greek, this Greco-Roman tradition, sort of come together. And so we see kind of the fleshiness of the limbs of the Mathuran tradition, but we see sort of the posture and the elegance of the Greek tradition that we saw in the Gandharian sculpture. And you can see all three of them together here. So, what I basically want you to kind of get out of this is that, like there is a sort of an evolution, if you will, of the images of the Buddha until we sort of, that is kind of brought together and sort of codified in the Gupta period, where these two traditions are brought together. And so let's look at the sort of symbols or lakshanas of the Buddha that tell us, a lot of things about the Buddha. We see the Ushnisha. The Ushnisha is a cranial bump that is meant to sort of represent an expanded consciousness. We see an urna. It's hard to see in this picture, but literally sort of the third eye, which initially took the form of a curled hair between Buddha's eyes, which is meant to represent expanded sight. We see stretched earlobes, which represent the Buddha having once been a adorned prince who wore heavy jewelry, and now he has removed it because he has sort of given up and eschewed his wealth and his desire for wealth. We often see images of deer, which are, of course, associated with his moment of enlightenment at the Deer Park. Lotuses, of course, are symbols of birth and death and rebirth. And then we see his hands in a position called a mudra. This one's called the Dhammachakra mudra, but mudras in general are hand gestures. Let me move my image out of the way. That tell you what Buddha is doing. Whether he is trying to offer a gesture of charity, or he is giving you, telling you not to fear, or the Dhammachakra where he is teaching. This is meant to sort of resemble the wheel of law, the Dharma. But these all have different meanings, and if you grew up in the Buddhist tradition, you would understand what these different mudras or different hand gestures meant. Let's look at some other Buddhist imagery. The Gupta Empire, the Guptas were Hindi, but they were very tolerant of Buddhists. And this is something we see in a lot of Hindu culture in general, because it is a very complex polytheistic religion that itself has absorbed the religions of many different peoples over the millennia. It can be very tolerant, and has been very tolerant through history at certain points of other religions. And so the Gupta Empire especially were quite tolerant of the Buddhist faith and Buddhist practices. We don't have a lot of early Buddhist paintings, or Hindu paintings for that matter. A lot of this has to do with the climate of India, and the tropical climate does not do well. Painting does not do well in tropical climates. Also, these paintings were made with a dry fresco technique. So true fresco is made with wet plaster, and so the wet plaster, the pigment dries into the plaster and it sticks to the wall. But in a dry fresco, the pigment is applied after the plaster is dried, so it doesn't adhere as well. And so we don't have as many paintings that have survived. That is a little different here, though, in the Ajanta. These Ajanta caves, which is a massive series of dozens and dozens of caves built by the Gupta Empire, containing both Hindu and Buddhist temples. Here is the interior of a Buddhist temple carved out inside one of the caves out of the rock itself. You can see a small stupa in the middle here. But over here we have a rare early Buddhist painting. This is of a figure called a bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas are people who have attained enlightenment, just like the Buddha did, but instead of sort of going into the next realm, instead of breaking this cycle, they remain on earth and they teach what they've learned to others. So they are teachers, and there's a whole assortment of bodhisattvas. This is Padmapani, but there's dozens and dozens of these, but they're always shown sort of like this, as sort of sensual male figures in this yaksha tradition, but often wearing luxurious crowns and robes and jewelry. And so even though they are meant to represent, this Buddhist concepts of moderation, here we have wealth functioning in the symbolic way, in much the same way we saw sex and fertility functioning in the Yakshi figure at the great stupa of Sanchi. We see wealth representing spiritual wealth. And so this crown is not just a crown, but it is the knowledge of this bodhisattva that he is willing to pass on to others. So let's talk about Hinduism now. This is, of course, the great religion of India. In fact, Hinduism and India are synonymous. They have the same root word in the word Indus, from the Indus River. And Hindu practices date, as we talked about, all the way back to the Vedic period. And some Hindu practices, as we saw, can even stretch as far back to the Harappan civilization. But Hindus believe in this concept of Brahman. It's the binding unity of all things. But the basic idea is that we live with the illusion that we are all individuals. This is called Maya. When in reality we are all Brahman. We are not separate. We are all part of one universal whole. And when we die, we are reborn and take on another reality in life. So this is samsara. This is birth and death and rebirth. Our next lives are determined by karma. This is basically the good and the bad we've done, how we've lived our lives, and how well we followed our dharma, our law, our rule, our proper way. Dharma are the duties, right, we should follow. And the ultimate goal is to awaken and realize that we're part of Brahman. So if this sounds very similar to Buddhism, well, yeah. It's, they come from the same roots. I mean, Hinduism had been around for a long time when Buddhism existed. Buddhism came about within the Hindu tradition, but there are some sort of significant differences. And, this life of moderation is certainly a big part of it. But anyway, the goal is to awaken and realize that you are part of this Brahman, this universal whole, and this awakening. And this frees you from samsara, and this is called moksha, or enlightenment. Nirvana is the Buddhist version of this. And this is taught in these books, the Upanishads, which I mentioned. So Hinduism is a polytheistic religion with numerous gods. But there's three main gods, and most of the other gods are aspects or avatars of these three main gods. We have Shiva, who's the destroyer god, often shown with multiple arms and heads, sometimes serpent scar and third eye. We have Vishnu, who is the preserver of the universe, often shown with four arms. They can take lots of different avatars. Vishnu can be shown as Krishna, but the Buddha himself. And then we have Devi, who's the great goddess. Sometimes she's called Uma, but once again, she'll show up in different aspects. So Hinduism can be, it's incredibly complicated, and I'm by no means an expert. I'm by no means even an amateur. It is a religion that is thousands of years old with lots of deep tradition. So I'm not here to introduce you to the religion in any sort of significant way, but just to lay down the bare bones basics. But like all of these religions we've been studying, there are regional traditions and variations and contradictory beliefs and subsets and subsects of Hinduism in the same way that there are of all religions. So I'm talking, once again, in very broad universal terms, and we're also looking at the earliest days and practices of Hinduism. And, we can sort of equate this with, if you're a Christian, for instance, many of the practices of the early church would seem very alien to the practices of a modern Christian or a modern Muslim or a modern anybody. These things change over time. So this also comes from the Gupta period. So the Gupta dynasty produced both Buddhist and Hindu art. This is one of the oldest Hindu temples, and it's at a place called Udayagiri. This is an image of Vishnu in one of his avatars, an avatar called Varaha, who is a man-boar. And the idea is that Lakshmi, his wife, is kidnapped, and she's kidnapped by this demon, and she's drowning in this cosmic ocean, this sort of infinite chaotic ocean, and he, with his head of a boar, comes and rescues her and pulls her out with his horn. So you can see her hanging onto that. So this sort of brings some of the basic concepts, though, of Hinduism here. This idea of goodness, right? This idea of sort of a moral obligation to be good and to be helpful, right? The obligation to fight against evil. These are kinds of at the roots of these stories. And that is what we're seeing here. This comes from a place called Badami. The Huns overthrow the Gupta Empire. We have a group of kings called the Chulukya kings who rule from Badami. These are cut images into cliffs above the city. This is an image of the god Shiva. This is in the side of a cave temple. But Shiva is this multi-armed god. You can see below the god Ganesha, who is the son of the goddess Devi. And Ganesha is an elephant-headed god, and he's often shown kind of cute and funny, often as a child. And so we see Ganesha imitating Shiva, this great sort of powerful god, and cute little Ganesha over here. But in both of these images, I think you can see the sort of fleshy style that we've already seen associated with images of Buddha. And in fact, if you want to think all the way back to the Harappan culture, and that sort of fleshy nude male torso, this seems to be kind of stylistically consistent over thousands of years. To show the body as sort of voluptuous, or as kind of having a thickness to it, kind of having a sensuality to it, kind of having a softness to it. Reflecting maybe a kind of a spiritual wealth of the body, right? This is an image also of Shiva. This is located on an island of Elephanta in Mumbai. This was created by for the king of the Kalachuri dynasty. So there's a bunch of these little dynasties. You're not responsible for this information, but this is located inside a shrine inside the cave, and it's huge. It's 18 feet tall. It depicts Shiva as the Lord of Lords, so Mahadeva. Notice he has three faces. There's actually four, but we see three. The central face kind of represents balance and quiet demeanor. The right face is the face of a woman, Uma, reflecting the concept of creation. And the left is a grimacing man, representing a god of destruction, Bhairavara. So this represents, in other words, this cycle of birth, life, death, rebirth, over and over and over again, which is central and inherent to the Hindu and Buddhist beliefs. And then finally we have, let me move my thing out of the way, an image of Vishnu asleep on the serpent Anatta. This comes from a temple in northern India, in Deoghar, India. This is one of the first temples constructed of stone block. It's not carved from a cave like the others we've seen. It depicts a saga of Vishnu. The idea is that Vishnu sleeps on this great serpent named Anatta. You can see his wife Lakshmi massaging his feet. And in this process, he dreams the universe into reality. This is a multi-headed serpent, and it forms almost like a canopy around him as he lounges. But in this sleep comes the dream of reality. And then we can see above the creator god Brahma sitting on a lotus that springs. Originally, this lotus would have come from his navel, but it is this once again an image of birth and rebirth, and we have this symbol of this three-headed symbol of creation floating above. At the bottom, we have more aspects of Vishnu's power, and they're fighting these sort of powerful demons. Once again, representing the conquering of good, the good conquering over evil, I should say. And these are all central themes. So, we've seen this idea of sort of moral obligation, this idea of good over evil, and we've seen this central concept of samsara, of birth, life, and rebirth as being central to the art of Hinduism. And that wraps up our lecture today. I will see you guys next time.